And in this webinar, we want to talk about, what are the traits of a good marathon build? We want to look at the best marathon runners in the world. What do they do? What do the best amateurs do? How do we construct plans? And what should a triathlete be thinking about when that running volume goes up? Um, what is marathon pacing? What is marathon nutrition? And I know Alex and some other good nutrition coaches are on this call, and they can jump in. And throughout this webinar, feel free to hop in and interrupt us and ask questions or offer your thoughts, because that's what this is all about. Um, so to get going, I wanted to talk about some really good studies that kind of encapsulate what a good marathon build should look like. Can everybody see this? Did I share it correctly? Cool. So one study I wanted to share looked at the training characteristics of top elite runners, and this was published in 2022. And what they found basically is that um, there was a lot of variety in their training. Oftentimes, athletes, when they move over and they start targeting a marathon, they start thinking, oh, I just need to run a bunch of miles at marathon pace, and I just need to run a lot. And honestly, that, that's an approach. It's a better approach than not running a lot, but the fact is the best marathon runners, they're spending time running fast also. And in this study, they found that athletes spent time running at high intensity, so call it VO2 max plus, and they ran a lot of miles. So the idea is that it's important to touch 5K pace. It's important to touch 10K pace in training. And I know Spencer, he sent over a good article, I guess is a newsletter that explored what Connor Mance and Clayton Young, what their training looked like in the 16 weeks leading into the Olympics, the Olympic marathon. And it was a good focused way. It basically they their training reflected this study. And they were running 120 miles a week. So number one is they're getting a lot of volume in. They spent a lot of time at 5K pace, 10K pace, like VO2 sessions sprinkled in, even in those 12 weeks going into the marathon. And for their easy runs, it's important to say that their easy run pace was 90 seconds to 2 minutes slower than marathon pace. So we want to spend a lot of time running easy when we're training for a marathon as well. But it isn't like training becomes just this slog of pure volume and marathon pace work. Although, as this study shows, volume is number one. So this study it's pretty famous. It's one of my favorite studies. It was published in 2021, and this study looked at a few hundred of the top distance runners on the planet. It's amazing they were able to gather all of this data. I mean, we're talking about world record holders, a bunch of sub 60-minute half marathon athletes, and they looked at their training logs and they tried to find, what type of training correlated most with finish time. And number one was volume. So run volume had the greatest correlation. The number two sort of training factor that led to a better performance was short intervals. So, 1,000 meters or less. So that's 3 to 4 minutes for, say, amateurs, max. So 3 to 4 minutes or less. The next correlation was tempo runs. So obviously tempo runs are important, continuous runs at tempo. And then the training factor that had the least correlation, or training type that had the least correlation, was long, hard intervals. So basically 1,000 meters plus faster than threshold. Those are less useful. So, when we're constructing a plan and when we coach athletes, we really do coach to this model. And, we've had great success with, emphasizing volume, still staying in touch with faster running, but really leaning into this tempo threshold running as well. And then, one last study I wanted to talk about was, we were looking at elites in these first two studies. This study looked at amateurs, so specifically 441 participants in the Rotterdam Marathon. And as you might expect, low training volume and a short long run was correlated with slower finish time. So if you're specifically those athletes running less than 25 miles a week with a long run less than 15 miles, peaking at less than 15 miles, those athletes finished slower than those training more than 65 kilometers per week or who did a long run greater than 30 to 35 kilometers. So basically what this is saying is, running more is a good thing and a longer run is a good thing up to a point. So those athletes who ran more than 20 miles for the long run, more than 18 to 20 actually didn't finish faster. So that's sort of interesting. So there is a limit. It seems like volume is important and a long run up to a certain point is important. So I don't know, Derek, if you wanted to talk about maybe minimum targets.
Definitely. Yeah. So I'll give a couple, caveats here. Like obviously these are some blanket statements, but generally speaking, if athletes are looking to perform relatively well in a marathon, 40 miles per week is a good target. And then like Conrad mentioned, the long run should definitely get up to 18 miles. These targets are good just to build obviously the capillary density, build the stress on the body. That way you're prepared enough for the marathon. This is goal dependent. Athletes that are looking to be a little bit more competitive, if they want to Boston qualify, for example, a lot of those athletes are going to be running 50 to 60 miles a week. And, so they're looking at guys trying to maybe break 3 hours for the marathon or women breaking 3:30. That's always a good benchmark to hit. And, I think the long run kind of holds true for that. 18 to 20 generally holds true. As, advanced amateurs get a little bit more competitive if they're trying to break, 240 or even 230 for the marathon, 60 to 70 miles a week or even more if their body can tolerate it, if they have the time. That's going to help them achieve those goals. And really the same thing with the long run though, 18 to 20 miles for those advanced competitive athletes hitting 60 to 70 miles a week. But there is some cases where athletes may run 22 miles for long runs. It just really depends on what their finishing time is for the marathon and where their zones are, because that's the biggest thing is it's like time on your feet. So like an athlete, if they're running 4 hours for a marathon, for example, they shouldn't do a long run at 22 miles because that's going to take so much out of their body at that point.
Right. And one thing I really wanted to highlight was this concept of durability. So Derek just talked about the importance of increasing volume and the importance of getting your long run up to, again, sort of at a minimum 18 miles. And this concept of durability is, I mean, it's not a new concept, but I think using the word durability to describe this is fairly new. So within the last few years in the exercise science world, I think it's become more of a focus. And so durability, and the way I'm talking about it, is the time of onset and magnitude of deterioration in physiological profiling characteristics during prolonged exercise. So basically what this is saying is we're trying to build durability. And what we're saying is there's a point, so these physiological profiling characteristics that deteriorate are things like heart rate and like ventilation, blood lactate, etc. It's the case that you can have a really high aerobic capacity or VO2 max, but low durability. So you might not be able to hold a high percentage of your threshold for a long period of time before we see these physiological profiling characteristics sort of kind of decouple with the pace you're running. So maybe at 80% of your VO2 max, an athlete who's durable might be able to hold that for an hour or 80 minutes, whereas somebody who's not durable, they might have the same VO2 max, but they can't hold a pace, that 80% of VO2 max in the same way as somebody who is durable. So their heart rate will start going up, their ventilation will start going up, so their economy will decrease as the duration increases, and their central nervous system just essentially shuts down, or they cannot recruit the muscles in the same way as somebody who's durable. So when we think about this concept and apply it to marathon running, I mean, durability is essentially the ability to hold a really high percentage of your threshold, or in the sports science world now, the trendy way to say it is maximum metabolic steady state. So, where is your maximum metabolic steady state, or the point at which, you're running at a high velocity, but we don't see lactate accumulating at a fast rate. We don't see heart rate skyrocketing or ventilation increasing. It's essentially anaerobic threshold, although exercise scientists don't like to say that anymore, or run threshold, critical velocity, whatever. We're trying to build the ability to hold a high percentage of that for a long period of time. And to do that, you have to run a lot of miles. You have to run high volume. That's among the best way to improve economy and the type of durability we need for a marathon. Although, again, we still want a sprinkling of high intensity work and marathon specific work, tempo, threshold work, etc. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts on anything we talked about so far? Nope.
I'll chime in.
Yep.
On the opposite end of the spectrum, I feel like I remember when I was first gearing up for some of my first few marathons as a working triathlete. I was actually surprised. I felt like the volume of running we did was actually relatively low compared to like other stuff I was reading online. Like you read about these people who are like trying to go sub 3 and they're like, oh, I'm doing 70, 80 miles a week. And I even when I went to Boston, I had people say, oh yeah, I've been training this. I'm like, shit, I've not gotten even close to that sort of running volume. But I think to your point, like volume is good to a certain point, but it really matters how you're spending that volume and, training in the right way and kind of, towing that line of not going too much, but also making sure the time you're going is efficient too. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, one thing about that too is time, like the longevity you've been running too. So like obviously, like I don't know what your background was before that, but if someone was like a collegiate runner, or if they've been running for years and years and years, they have that base to build upon. And then it also kind of boils down to recovery as well. If like the athlete has the time to run 70, 80 miles a week and they have the ability to recover, maybe they like take away like what their performance is and your performance was, they may be optimizing what they can do within that time period as well.
Yeah, and the other side of this is, to what extent is cross training, how does that enhance marathon performance? And I think the answer is it enhances it a lot. It has the potential to kind of be a game changer because, just absolute cardiorespiratory fitness is important. And, we threw out that 40-mile per week number, and, that wasn't just arbitrary. Like the correlation between finish time and volume, it becomes less and less pronounced once you get above 40 miles per week. One should run as many miles per week as they reasonably can. Okay. Like the elites, Conor Mantz, Clayton Young, just as the most recent example, both of them finished top 10 at the Olympics. Again, they run 120 miles a week. That's a lot. If they were running 60 miles a week, would they be running as fast? Probably not. But almost very, very, very few people have the resiliency to do that. That takes years and years and years to get up to that kind of volume. Certainly way more than 2 years of just running. Those athletes have been running, since they were probably 13 or 14. And by the time they were in college, they went to BYU, and they were, I don't know what they were running, but I mean, very few collegiate runners are running 100 miles a week too. They're most collegiate runners are still building. So it's important to not get hurt also. But yeah, I mean, somebody who really wants to maximize genetic potential in the marathon, they should allocate multiple years of building slowly. Um, so, but yeah, so we don't want to belittle the benefit of cycling. And I think that, you know, more and more high level athletes are kind of integrating cross training into their regimens, and they're not just trying to run, you know, massive volume.
Conrad, can you also talk a little bit about your definition of tempo? Because it a lot of coaches use that word, and it could mean anything from marathon pace all the way up to sub 10K pace. Like when you think about tempo in the context of marathon training, how would you define it?
So I define tempo as running basically in sort of in zone 3 to low zone
Okay.
4. And this sort of gets into a little bit of the nitty gritty. So mainly really in the exercise science world, oftentimes there's only like 3 zones. I mean, if you want to remove the extreme zone, but so basically, you know, you have your first threshold right here. That's where that's essentially, well, right here. It's the crossover point from zone 2 to zone 3, and that's where we sort of see, you know, the first kind of like increase in blood lactate. That's kind of how you can also look at as VT1 if you're breathing into, you know, if you're using a metabolic cart and you're looking at ventilation, and that's like the first kind of uptick. And then it kind of flans out a little bit through zone 3, and then there's another steep increase in ventilation or an increase in blood lactate, and this is basically critical power or max. You're basically your max lactate average steady state, wherein, you know, you can be right here, and it's basically the inflection point. So if you're just below this, the blood lactate concentration will be essentially even, and it's not going to decouple tremendously. It will start decoupling over time, but I mean, you should be able to hold critical velocity or, you know, anaerobic threshold for a while, you know, 30 minutes to 60 minutes maybe. But so this is threshold running, and that's not what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about tempo running, I'm talking about a little bit slower than threshold, sort of in this heavy domain. Marathon pace for a lot of athletes is really close to 70.3 pace. It's a pace that they can, well, obviously maintain for a marathon, but it's decidedly sub threshold, but it's not comfortable. So we want to think about it as comfortably hard from a perceived exertion perspective, and sort of in this heavy domain, but not in the severe domain. The severe domain is basically critical power to VO2 max. VO2 max is really hard. Think about it in terms of, like, you know, mile to 5K pace, critical velocity or threshold. That's right around, you know, 10K to half marathon pace. So we want to be just slower than that when we're doing tempo runs. But it also depends on what we're talking about. Somebody who's if they're running a 2-hour half marathon, then they're actually going to be running it, you know, right at tempo pace. So tempo pace can be half marathon pace. That's a sort of a long answer to your question, but
Awesome. Thank you.
I would say tempo running is just a little bit easier than threshold.
Got it.
You should be able to hold it for, I would say, 90 minutes to at least 90 minutes plus.
So that's 7 out of 10 RPE.
Yeah, I would say 7 to 8, that range.
Yeah, like within the realms of, like, for like a well-trained athlete that's competitive, probably within the realm of like a marathon pace.
Yeah, I think that's right. Basically 90 to 95% of threshold velocity is a good way to think about it. So, you know, if your threshold pace, you know, right here is 10 miles per hour, or, you know, 6 minutes per mile, a good target would be, you know, 9 to 9.5 miles per hour for tempo. That's a good question. And then, so moving on to another consideration, somebody want to talk about this concept of resiliency or staying healthy?
Yeah, I can jump in. Obviously a big piece of any athlete's training is staying healthy. The silver bullet is sleep. And everyone asks like what they should be doing. Getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night is always good. I think people are aiming for 8 hours of sleep every single night. That's like the benchmark. That's the gold standard. Athletes that are training a lot, like obviously pro athletes and elite athletes that may not be working full time or they don't have a family, they're probably sleeping even more because they have the ability to nap throughout the day. But at the end of the day, like sleep is the silver bullet. Nutrition, hydration is also very important. Athletes should be also consuming electrolytes, sodium, intra workout. Obviously, if it's hot in the summertime, taking sodium throughout the day as well, not just just plain water, because you want to make sure your body is hang on to the fluids in your body as well. I know cold plunges have become a big thing. Did we talk about this on a recovery podcast once? I can't remember exactly where the
Yeah, I think we
studies.
talked about that. I mean, I
This
sent
was a
out a
little
weekly
bit.
nugget about it.
What's that?
I sent out a weekly nugget about
Okay.
it a while ago about how cold therapy might negatively impact muscle protein synthesis. Um, if you do it, like if you do a hard workout, this is probably more applicable to strength training, when you're trying to achieve hypertrophy or just get bigger muscles. But, working out and then hopping in an ice bath isn't necessarily the best approach. Um, I know Alex,
Yeah, I'm unmuted to chime in. Yeah, so the research suggests you're right. It tends to be a lot of the studies that are reviewing it now is as it relates to muscle protein synthesis. So, I mean, certainly we're aiming to have that as part of our training regimen for marathon running. But, maybe a little bit more focused for someone who's really, really trying to make gains in the gym. But what the studies support is a 4-hour removal from activity so that you don't blunt the effect. And it makes a lot of sense because a lot of what this cold water therapy, which in some cases is beneficial, is it's blunting that process. It is attacking stress within our body. And the reality is that exercise is stress on our body, and that any of these sort of like muscle breaking down, muscle building elements, it relies on this initial stressor point to break down for it then to build up anabolically. And so when we have the effect of a cold plunge within that 4-hour window of exercise, it's doing the opposite of what that actual exercise activity is seeking to accomplish. So what I say to athletes is if you must do it before the exercise is due to occur. Maybe do it right, when you wake up in the morning, before you're sort of having your pre-breakfast before you're going out for your training, complete your training. Definitely do not do it before you're about to go to sleep because it's accomplishing the opposite from a thermoregulatory standpoint. It's cooling us. And so our body's natural reaction is to heat up, which is the opposite of what we want to do before we go to bed. It's not going to be supportive of sleep progression. And then otherwise, if you do want to do it post-exercise, recommend doing it within 4 hours. The only instance in which cold water therapy is scientifically supported, post exercise is in the instance of pain mitigation when you have multiple activities back to back. So like on a race day, if you're doing 2 events and you're experiencing pain that needs to be mitigated, cold water application may be beneficial in the interceding period between those events.
yeah, if I was building this pyramid, I would probably consolidate massage into that compression recovery layer and put it before water immersion.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it was
Yeah,
that good.
at the end of the day, like athletes need to really focus on it, especially if athletes are really trying to optimize their load and you're running more, it's pretty traumatic to the body. So taking care of the body, listening to your body, if anything pops up, taking care of it right away. You know, Getting massages is always good, but also seeing a PT if need be, if there's any types of aches and pains that pop up
Mm.
that are preventing you to run. And I know there's been scales of what may lead you to like take some time off. Like if it pains out like over a 3 out of 10, you should probably peel back the volume. If you're feeling the pain the day after a workout, you definitely got to address it right away and take care of it. Otherwise, you know, you don't want to set back going into a marathon because the volume is big, and you want to make sure you just recover going into each workout.
Yeah. We definitely want to highlight self-myofascial release, specifically just foam rolling. That it's one of my favorite recovery modalities because it enhances blood flow to the muscles for a long time, even after you do it. And it also kind of breaks up those adhesions that occur and with the muscles and the fascia. You don't want everything glued together because that's going to inhibit the ability of sort of the motor units to activate the muscle fibers in the correct way. And you want everything to remodel well, like the muscle fibers to remodel well, and just having everything kind of loose and not sort of activated. You want those muscles to kind of relax as they're recovering. You don't want them all tight. You don't want the fascia adhering on everything. You want to have the ability to move smoothly and for the muscles to activate well, muscle fibers to activate, you know, in a good pattern, and for everything to work well. So foam rolling, in my opinion, is the ultimate way to do that. Massage is also great. But the most
Conrad, when are you sorry to jump in, but when are you foam rolling? So you've got a workout or a couple of workouts in a given day. Are you foam rolling afterwards? You foam rolling before? Obviously, there's different ways of doing it, but what's your approach? In the same way as the cold therapy question.
For recovery, you want to do it after, and you know, I mean, you could do it immediately after or an hour later. You know, you could do it before you go to bed. There is something to be said for foam rolling before a workout, specifically if an athlete has muscle groups that are just tight or activated, because we want to kind of inhibit those. For most triathletes, or honestly most athletes in general who sit a lot, it kind of makes sense to roll out, especially those hamstrings. You know, it's probably less important to roll out the glutes because we want to activate those glutes. So you know, rolling out the hamstrings and then doing things like unilateral bridgers or bird dogs or fire hydrants, that's probably the best way to kind of get ready for a workout. So if we're talking about foam rolling before a workout, we kind of want to foam roll tight muscles. It might be wise to roll out the calves as well. But specifically for recovery and probably the ultimate use of foam rolling, I would argue that it's for recovery and you want to do it after a workout, especially to get that blood flowing.
Thanks.
Yep. So anybody have any other questions or comments on recovery, staying healthy?
One note about foam rolling is you have to make sure that you're holding the poses long. You're not just quickly going over the muscles. It hurts when you're foam rolling, and it's try to aim for 30 seconds if you find that tight spot. Because what's going to happen is once you find that tight spot, hold that foam roller, especially if it's a knobby foam roller, hold that foam roller or that tennis ball on that tight spot for 30 seconds, because after 30 seconds, that's when your muscle starts to realize, all right, I can relax now. So it's important to hold those tight spots, especially the glutes, for 30 seconds or longer to be able to release those muscles, which is what we want with the foam rolling technique.
For sure. Exactly. And those are sort of like hot spots or knots. Just basically muscle fibers that are kind of tight.
I think too, I mean, just harping on it again, the sleeping is just always super underrated. You know, one of my favorite podcast episodes I listened to was Christian Blumenfeld on the Rich Roll podcast, and he kind of went through the same thing where he went through the recovery pyramid, and Christian Blumenfeld even said, he's like, I don't really do any of the other stuff. I just sleep as much as I possibly can all the time. And, you know, obviously works out well. And, you know, you definitely feel it when you don't have the sleep in there.
Yeah, that's a good point. I feel like I spend a lot of my time talking about these with athletes when really, you know, This is it. This is what it's all about. It's not sexy. It's not exciting. It's not novel, but I mean, it is. It's the game changer. It's the biggest performance enhancer that you can do. Just sleep and be lazy.
Yeah, just like training, consistency with sleep is so valuable. Like I tell every athlete, like if you can get a consistent bedtime every night, that sets the tone the rest of the day, because you wake
Yeah.
up. When people have disrupted evenings and they're up later, it messes up the next day, miss workouts. Obviously, you may be groggy going into a workout, you don't recover as well, and things like that.
And I should also highlight, the second part of this, which is mental recovery and relaxation. So anything that kind of enhances parasympathetic flow, something that relaxes you, meditation, reading a book, vegging out and watching Netflix, like, believe it or not, that can actually enhance training. Like, it's a good excuse it's good to give yourself permission to relax and de-stress. Oftentimes we're kind of guilty if we're not doing something. I know I have this problem of just turning everything off, turning my mind off. So, this can help, whatever it is, guided meditation, yoga, listening to a podcast, just etc. So, do you want to talk about workout types?
I can take this one. Oh,
Go ahead, Chris.
all right. Awesome. So we got a couple different workout types in our marathon build. As Conrad said, the bulk of your workouts are going to be easy runs. That's going to be the bread and butter of your workouts. Most of your workouts will be easy runs. How easy is too easy? Honestly, anything over speed walking is going to be fine. If you're at conversation pace, if you're able to hold a conversation pace with your friend, with whoever you're running with, or by yourself, that's easy. If you think you're going too fast, then you're most likely going too fast. So easy runs, that's going to be the bulk of your workouts. As far as distance for easy runs, that could be anything, 40 to 60 minutes, maybe even longer. But that gets into what long runs are. And long runs are your, as the name implies, longest runs of the week. Depending on your level and depending on how far out from the marathon, it could be anything from 10 miles all the way up to 18 or 20. Once again, depending on your running history, your injury risk, and other factors such as that. This is your first marathon. Chances are your long run is you're going to build up gradually up into that 18 to 20. Anything over 20, you definitely are running the risk of, especially for I would say age group runners, non-elite runners. If your long run is over 20 miles, then you do run the risk of injury. A lot of people say, oh, I need that long run for the psychological boost of being able to know that I can do the last 10K. And that is fine, but it is not critical. And that's a discussion you need to have between you and your coach, and to see if that would be appropriate for your situation. Marathon pace work. Sometimes long runs, your marathon pace work can be built into your long runs. Whether that is a fast finish, so if you're running 18 miles, the first 12 are an easy to moderate pace, and then the last 6 you're going up to your marathon pace. But race-specific marathon pace work, that's going to be sprinkled in throughout your program. This is a great opportunity with this to work on nutrition, to dial in your hydration and nutrition. Do jelly beans or sports beans work for you? Do you need to go with pH chews? Are you going to go with all liquid pH or precision hydration? Does that work with your stomach? How are you going to carry that? That's another big one that a lot of people overlook. Are you going to run with a handheld, or are you going to run with just relying on aid stations? That's something that you need to think about and practice in this marathon pace work. This, next to easy runs, I would say the marathon pace work would be, doesn't have to I would say start to build in every week, a little bit here, and then gradually as you get closer and more race specific with your workouts, marathon pace work starts to become a lot more percentage wise of your miles. Threshold and tempo, as we talked about before, this could be anything above moderate all the way under 10K to half marathon pace, once again depending on your abilities and depending on your critical pace values. Next up is speed sessions. Speed sessions in the hierarchy of this are great because it's training your body to go over race pace. And in doing so, trains you metabolically and is going to raise that threshold. So if you think of your threshold or your quote unquote ceiling, that marathon pace work and tempo pace, that's going to boost your threshold from the bottom. The speed sessions are going to boost your threshold and bring it up from the top. That could range everything from 5K effort to 3,200 meter effort. Once again, depending on your abilities. But speed sessions are important. It teaches your legs to turn over quickly, builds those neurological connections so that your legs can turn over quickly, and then also just helps you thinking about building up your VO2 engine and your ability for your body to use oxygen. All of these are important. Some examples of these different types of workouts: easy runs, 40-minute easy, finishing with strides. And strides, very important for your easy runs and your long runs, finishing with strides at almost every type of run, where you start off as an easy jog, building for 10, 15 seconds to 5K effort, and then building it back down, full walk recovery, doing 4 to 5 of those 15 to 20-second strides at the end of every easy or long run goes a long way to building up that leg turnover rate. Example of a long run could be 13 miles, easy to moderate. It could be 12, as I said, 10 miles easy, 5 miles at that goal marathon pace. It could be 3 by 3 miles at marathon pace with a half a mile recovery in between. Tempo threshold, 2 by 15 minutes, 3 by 10 minutes, 2 by 20 minutes at that just under half marathon pace effort. Speed sessions, mile repeats, negative split repeats. Those are a little bit more advanced, but it could be something like 800-meter repeats with 2 minutes recovery. It could be 1,200 meters with the last 200 meters picking up the pace, teaching your body to change gears towards the end of an interval. So those are just some examples that are typically sprinkled in throughout a marathon build. And I think that's it. Any questions on those? I'm sure the other coaches have their go-to marathon workouts. I love mile repeats, and those aren't all out either. Those are at I would say around 10K effort, 10K to 5K effort. So nothing crazy, but it's that volume that is really gonna, the volume plus that little bit of intensity will really go a long way in building your fitness.
Yeah, one thing I want to say about volume too, and we obviously kind of already alluded to the higher volume, generally the better if you can tolerate it. But triathletes are no stranger to doubles or 2-a-days, and runners, you can only run so many hard sessions in a week. The rest of it is going to be easy, and that's when a lot of double runs come in. If you do a workout in the morning, the afternoon or evening is when you have some more volume, and that's when you can add some more easy runs in as well.
Yep.
And that's obviously athlete dependent based on total volume and where you are.
Yeah, those great explanations. So when we think about periodization of a training cycle, I mean, there are a couple of different approaches. When we think about building linear periodization, is basically you start with easy volume and then you do tempo stuff, and then you finish with really high intensity stuff. That's like the Fitzinger approach. The Hansen approach is probably the one that we generally support, and that is you build the base, do some intensity, and then as the race approaches, you go race specific. And then part of that race specific work is simulating nutrition, like Chris sort of mentioned during your long runs. It's simulating course conditions. You know, if you're doing a really hilly run or race, like you're doing flying monkey. I know Nick Humphrey is doing flying monkey. He needs to be doing his long runs at Percy Warner Park, which is where the race is. It's really hilly there. No greenway runs, long runs. And then, so, you know, but a really important component of sort of tactics, it's nutrition. And, you know, I think we kind of want to hone in on this a little bit because it is so important. And I know that, you know, Alex and Chris are nutrition coaches. They know a lot and they're on this call. So maybe we can just hop into it and think about intra-race nutrition. Alex, I don't know if do you want to kind of just give an overview of race nutrition, sort of the concepts of, you know, pre-race nutrition and then intra-race?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll try to be succinct. I know we've got about 15 minutes on the clock here. So maybe just following these topical points here so we can say on point and on task. So from a carb loading perspective, we have a lot of classical studies and research that supports carbohydrate loading as being beneficial. I would say for athletes out there, maintaining a relatively high carbohydrate diet, generally speaking, is very helpful. But there is a ton of value in the 36 hours, say, preceding an event like a marathon race, in actually applying a high carbohydrate load diet for the day. I think it's very important to draw a distinction here. When we say carb loading, we do not mean overeating. So it is not just increasing portions of everything throughout the day. It is very targeted and specific. And so it's between 7 to 10 kilograms, grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight, you know, maybe on the lower end for a marathon event, just given the duration of it, if we think about it in the context of maybe longer endurance events where we might be applying a carb loading strategy. And really focusing on just a disproportionate allocation of the diet throughout the day toward carbohydrates. Think like 70% of your diet being carbohydrate focused, focusing on low fat, low fiber from a GI distress perspective. So really trying to get ahead of that. And then I think especially the season that we're in right now, and perhaps even for future seasons, depending on where your race is located, hyperhydration strategies for that evening before. So either thinking of something like a really high sodium containing meal the night before, if you're like a stir fry fan with lots of rice the evening before for that pre-race meal, having that with a bunch of soy sauce or coconut aminos or tamari or whatever the case may be for a sodium bolus, or even doing something like actually sipping sports drink the evening before to top off your electrolyte stores and really help to boost your hydration status going into the race. And then when we think about, and I think worthwhile to recommend picking a standard meal that you can sort of even incorporate for the evening before your long runs during training is really helpful. So again, we can assess gut tolerance, build gut tolerance to the extent it's something that needs to be honed and practiced. And then also consider what we actually have available to us at the race location. So, you know, if you're traveling overseas for a race and you always have spaghetti and meatballs the night before, you know, your event, and it's not accessible where you're traveling, I think no need to put a gamble there. And to the extent you can incorporate something that you know you can have, that's a good practice, if not only a ritual to build in for that, you know, psychological element of pre-race nutrition. And then the morning of pre-exercise, it's a pretty broad range. The research supports like 1 to 4 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight. And a good rubric is if you have 4 hours, do the 4 grams per kilogram. If you have 3 hours, do 3 grams per kilogram, 2 hours, 1 hour, etc. And following that, that's a good rubric and approach for what you might enjoy for your, you know, pre-exercise breakfast. Again, I think incorporating that into your training regimen is helpful to, again, assess and potentially build gut tolerance. I think immediately post-race, so it's important to sort of like top off the glycogen stores. We're topping off our liver glycogen. We're providing that exogenous glycogen that's converted into glucose in our body When you start the marathon, your glucose concentration is going to suddenly drop. And so this is a consequence of the effect of insulin from, potentially what we're taking in, and also from the effect of exercise. It's trying to remove glucose from circulation. Sometimes that can drop so quickly, you might experience nausea, dizziness, that's like hypoglycemic reaction. And so you can either keep running through that, it'll restore. This is if you're, taking something immediately post-run. A strategy to get around that is either to take it within 10 minutes of the start time, so just moving it closer so that you can time that glucose intake, so there's not enough time for the glucose and the insulin in your body to rise and cause that hypoglycemic effect, or separate it even further from the activity. So call it, 40 minutes plus. My typical recommendation is, if you're going to take like a gel, do it about, 5 to 10 minutes before the start, let that kick in, and then have it be sort of part of your intra-race nutrition strategy, and potentially considering something with caffeine if that's something that works for you, and is comfortable within your body. I find that the limiter tends to be tolerance, not absorption, when it comes to these things. So again, 6 to 12 weeks in advance of your marathon, really getting in with applying what this strategy will look like, so that you're able to assess what you can tolerate. And that can change. What you can tolerate can change as you focus on a GI build. Really quickly here, 60 to 90 grams of carbs per hour is a good general range. I would say if you're doing a really, really fast marathon, call it, 2.5 hours. I think you can get up closer to that 90 gram of carb threshold. If you're doing a 5-hour marathon, I think sticking closer to the lower end, 60 gram part of that range is reasonable. Most of the sports products that you have out there on the market leverage this sort of composition, but looking for something that allows for multiple transport is helpful. And what I mean by that is different sugar types. So glucose and fructose, or glucose might also be seen on the back of a label as maltodextrin, which is just chains of glucose, or dextrose, which is glucose outside of the body, if you're looking at the back of your sports nutrition pack. That's actually going to be taken up by a different receptor than fructose. And what research has found is that you're able to take in about 60 grams of glucose, dextrose, maltodextrin. And then on top of that, you can tolerate maybe an additional 30 on the fructose side. And so leveraging that multiple transport chain phenomenon / reality that exists is really helpful. There are some people, and we definitely have talked about this in prior Ironman triathlon related podcasts and webinars, can take up to 120. I don't think it's reasonable, quite frankly, for a marathon. I mean, if you can tolerate it and you identify that you have some sort of performance optimization impact from it, but I think majority of the research we have out there really looks at that 90 gram of carb as the gold standard high end as it relates to intra-race intake. I think, fluid, highly individuated based off of our, just what our bodies need. But I think 500 to 750 milliliters of fluid per hour is a good general range, whether you're relying on, some sort of handheld or on-course hydration. The key here is just not having more than 2 to 3% loss of body weight by the end of the, training bout or event. 2%, particularly for higher heat, higher humidity conditions, and 3% for cooler, lower humidity conditions is a good general range. Super easy to do, like a at-home sweat test. This is not like the precision hydration, high quality sweat composition test that's offered. This is purely looking at sweat rate, sweat losses, and it is as easy as weighing yourself before, weighing yourself after, taking note of any fluid consumed during, and being able to calculate what your rate of loss is there to really nail in, what your ideal rate of intake should be. And maybe one point of discussion here is, is this drinking to thirst? Is this drinking to plan? I would say that we really do need to drink to plan when it comes to these races. There are 3, kind of good reasons for that. Drinking to thirst. Thirst is not a great mechanism for us. It's really a learned response. We see a lot of people walking around with, I like to call them emotional. This is not a personal joke. This is something I've co-opted from like a comedy special I listened to at one point, and who credit I'm not going to be able to give correctly, but like an emotional support Stanley water bottle. Like these people are not perpetually dehydrated. Like they've learned that they need to hydrate throughout the day, and they have it handy so they can drink, pretty repetitively. So it's a learned response, it's a learned behavior. It's not a very sensitive mechanism, and you also can't plan for thirst. So when we think about these events, if you only drink when you're thirsty, you're probably waiting for the latter part of the event when your absorption is not as just readily responsive. And so we don't want our GI tract not working as well and not being as sensitive to absorb fluids or carbs or whatever the case may be. We really want to try to front load in some cases during that early part of the marathon and sort of get ahead of it. And I would say drinking too little is more common, while drinking too much is rare. And so, building knowledge as power here is really important and impactful. And then carrying gels. I know Chris actually started to talk a little bit about this as he was talking about, even intra-training, planning for this and gaining some experience of what you want to do. I think first and foremost, identifying what you cannot do on race day is really helpful. So if you're running the New York City Marathon, I think a couple of folks on this call are, I know I have a client who's running it. You can't use a vest, for example, during that race. And so don't train with a vest holding all of your sports nutrition if you can't actually leverage that on race day. If first and foremost, not only to impact potentially your running form and your posture while you're out there training, but also, providing the opportunity to actually build experience with what product mix you'll use. I do think that testing out course nutrition in training is helpful. So being able to know, can I tolerate a Martin gel? Can I tolerate Gatorade Endurance? Am I able to grab a course cup and actually drink it while I'm moving? Things like these are all really helpful questions to have answered for ourselves. But I think being able to be nimble on course is also helpful. So if you're doing a race that is sort of community supported and they run out of nutrition, have a plan for how you would respond in kind, and or if you personally are carrying nutrition and you have a fall and it all tumbles away, I think a little bit less relevant for a marathon race. But I don't know, course conditions may be dicey out there, I'm not sure. Also understanding what from the course mix you can tap into, I think is helpful. I think gels, you definitely can put them into like a handheld water bottle, actually out of the packages, so that you're not having to fiddle and fuddle with a bunch of packages that you're having to open, with the concern of carrying all of them, and then also figuring out where you're going to dispose of the wrappers so that we can be good Samaritans and not litter, is one sort of route or option people might consider. I'll maybe pause to see if there's any recommendations from coaches or athletes on the line who've found something that either works really well or that they typically recommend for their athletes as it relates to nutrition during a marathon, if we're self-supporting.
I think the precision fuel and hydration, the flow gel, is and just putting that into a handheld water bottle and using the handheld water bottle. So using the fluids on course to be able to get your hydration in, and then keep the calories in and be able to sip on those calories continuously. In one water bottle, I think you can pack up to, correct me if I'm wrong here, Conrad, but I think 300 grams in one bottle of the flow gel. So that's about 1 or 2 pouches. So that will have you covered for the whole marathon. So I think that is the way to go, if especially for longer marathons. If you're thinking about finishing in that 3.5 to 4 hour range, being able to have that one bottle and sipping on that, and then really making sure you hit every aid station for that water to stay on top of your hydration.
Yeah, that's definitely the simplest way. You can also take 7 gels, 6 to 8 gels in a flip belt or something, if you don't like holding and running with something. Because I think the flow gel, it's 300 grams. I don't know how many. You figure, I guess it's less than a pound, less than 500 mils, but it's not nothing. But most athletes can adapt to running and holding that volume of gel. So I would say that those are the 2 best approaches. Getting your carbs from gels. Again, I like precision gels. Martin gels are often available on course and they sit well with athletes. Those are kind of the 2 ultimate gels. But yeah, I would say bottle, or gels and a flip belt. Anybody have any questions or comments about race nutrition? Cool. And then last thing is just this question that often comes up when people sign up for an Ironman. Should I run a marathon before? And my answer usually is no, it doesn't matter if they've never run a marathon before, because it's just so different. The pacing is completely different. Ironman, you're right at zone 2, it's slower. A standalone marathon is actually quite fast if you want to maximize your potential. Perhaps surprisingly fast, especially if you train well for it and build durability. But that's just one little nugget that I wanted to throw out there, that training for a marathon, a standalone marathon, is completely different to the demands of training for an Ironman marathon. Completely different beasts. Don't even think of them in the same in the same realm. You can run a marathon very fast, believe it or not. Does anybody have any questions in general on anything?
I'll just jump in the last note you said. That's why we see a lot of athletes that we coach in the triathlon world do marathons in the fall, winter, or early spring. Kind of polarize the triathlon in their running brackets that way, because the marathon just takes a lot of time to recover from. So if you want to compete in both triathlon and a marathon, it's good to separate the seasons a little bit and polarize those a little bit.
I would argue that a standalone marathon probably requires just as much recovery than a full Ironman.
Yeah.
Literally think of a true standalone marathon where one runs as fast as they can is more corrosive on the body than an Ironman. Because you
I'm
just
still recovering from Glass City.
seriously, it's different. So keep that in mind also. You can't just slide in a marathon into an annual plan just because you've done an Ironman. You know what I'm saying? I literally think the recovery costs are higher in a standalone marathon.
And this is like if you absolutely want to optimize training for
Right.
these races as well. Like obviously we have athletes that they have a bucket list race, and let's say it's Berlin or a summer season marathon, and they're doing triathlon as well. Like it's not going to be optimal, but you can still do it. But if you want to optimize the performance, you want to make sure you're separating those a little bit.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Any questions on anything? Nope. Well, thanks for hopping on, guys, and feel free to keep the conversation going on Slack and send over any questions on anything marathon related there.
Thanks,
Thank you very
everyone.
much, guys.
All right.
Brilliant.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
See ya.